Welcome to the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I'm the marketing manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CannMed conference. First off, I do apologize for the lack of quality in the video here if you're watching us. I'm actually on the road at a conference, so I'm in a hotel room with my fake background here. I hope it's not too much of a distraction. It's only going to be for this intro and for the outro. The actual interview is going to be the same quality that you know and love, but wanted to acknowledge it right off the top. Okay, just a few reminders before I introduce this week's guest. If you're listening to this episode on the day it's released, then I'd like to remind you that the early bird deadline for the CannMed 24 Innovation and Investment Summit is this Friday, December 1st. Yes, Friday, December 1st is the last day you can purchase your CannMed 24 ticket at the lowest price available. You will save $300 off our full summit package, which includes access to the medical practicum, industry workshops, oral presentations, poster presentations, networking events, meals, and a 3-night stay at the JW Marriott Marco Island Resort with all the associated amenities. Head over to CannMedEvents.com now to register, and I hope to see you in Florida this May. Also, our CannMed Advisory Board is reviewing the abstract submissions we received for oral and poster presentations, and we hope to be announcing some presenters very soon. You may have already seen that we announced that the Capital Markets Workshop will return for CannMed 24, led by Golden Eagle Partners. And we are also going to have a special nursing panel on Sunday, May 13th. You can learn more about both of those sessions at CannMedEvents.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for email alerts so you can get those announcements right to your inbox. My guest today is Dr. Karla Gage. Karla is Assistant Professor of Weed Science and Plant Biology at Southern Illinois University Carbondale, where she received her Ph.D. in plant biology with a focus in weed ecology in 2013. In short, Karla is a weed expert, but not in the weed that you smoke, but rather the weeds that you pull. Her research focuses on using integrated weed management to control and suppress weeds in midwestern U.S. rotational crops, including corn, soybean, wheat, and now hemp. During our conversation, we discussed what negative effects weeds can have on hemp, which weed species are threatening to hemp, herbicides that are approved for hemp and the threat of herbicide resistance, integrated weed management strategies such as crop rotation, cover crops, chaff lining, plastic coverings, and more, and how feral hemp varieties may have traits to help breed for more resistant hemp varieties. Before we get to my conversation with Karla, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Rare Earth Genomics. Rare Earth Genomics Texas is a partnership formed to accelerate hemp research and produce critical tools for the farmer. REG's mission is to increase the likelihood of a successful harvest through genetic analysis and rigorous environmental testing of vigorous cultivars. Reliable data sets, analytic tools, and stable germplasm are core to the program. Success for the farmer is the goal. You can learn more at rareearthgenomics.com. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Karla Gage. Good afternoon, Karla. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here to talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you today about weed control in outdoor hemp. Now, we've covered other plant pathogens on the podcast before: hop latent viroid, powdery mildew, pythium, botrytis, all those things, and even got into pests before with russet mites, spider mites, etc., but never weeds. So this will be interesting. I suspect that's because so much of cannabis cultivation occurs indoors, but I know that the majority of hemp cultivation is outdoors. And after all, hemp and cannabis are the same plant for all intents and purposes. So it'd be fun to dive into this. So let's start with the basics. What are the negative effects that weeds can have on hemp?
Yeah, well, with any crop, right? Weeds can directly compete by taking resources that the crop needs, resources like nutrients, water, space. So there's that direct form of competition, but there are also other indirect things that happen. For example, cannabis can exude some biochemical substances that can interfere with the growth of other plants potentially. That's something that my lab has been looking at. But weeds do the same thing, right? So a weed that's competing with a crop plant may be releasing biochemical compounds or having other effects on that plant that are beyond just the direct competition for nutrients.
Right. And now I know that hemp can be grown for all different sorts of things, fiber, grain, seed, and of course, cannabinoid-rich flour. So are there different considerations there for how weeds can affect the crop for what the crop will be used for?
Yeah, so it's pretty amazing to look at all the different crop morphologies, meaning that if you're growing for each of those different commodities, the crop that you're growing is going to probably look different. For example, if I'm growing a fiber crop, that plant has been bred over time to grow directly upright, to not branch very much. And it's planted very densely together in the field. So for weed competition, that would be a very competitive crop. And if it gets established, there should be relatively few weeds coming up below that crop canopy. And you can contrast that with how dual purpose crops are grown. So those would be crops that you would harvest for both seed and fiber potentially. And those are typically shorter plants. They're a little bit more branchy, and they're spaced out more in the field, so there's more potential for weed competition below that crop canopy. And then, of course, the most sensitive type of cultivation to weed competition would be the CBD floral biotype, where, you know, those plants, they are branchy, you know, they do take up a lot of space as they grow, but they're planted at a pretty good distance from one another. And then you have to do some weed control around them, whether that's, you know, black plastic mulch or other organic mulches. There has to be some other type of weed control tactic because the crop itself is not going to suppress weeds as well. So yeah, depending on what commodity type you're growing, the weed control problems are or can be dramatically different.
Yeah. And are there any sort of numbers around like weeds can affect your yield by X%?
Yeah, so actually, that is such a fascinating question. And that is really one of the things we're trying to determine with our research. In 2019, there was a publication that came out. It was basically a review of all the global literature looking at hemp cultivation. And of the publications that were reviewed, weeds were either neglected, not even mentioned in the publications, or they were mentioned as inconsequential to the yield. So that brings up a really good question, right? I mean, we know that this should be a competitive crop. Hemp is a nitrophilous species, meaning it should be able to accumulate nitrogen and use nitrogen very efficiently, and could probably outcompete a lot of other plants. But the key seems to be getting it established, because even in our own research, we have seen a good number of crop failures when the weeds come up before the hemp or at the same time as the hemp. And then, you know, a lot of times we don't even get a good hemp stand. You know, we see the weeds and not the hemp. So we know that competition is a problem, yet the effects have been inconclusive. And one of the things that my lab has been working on, we do have some funding from the USDA as part of a larger multi-state project, and we've been looking at what is called the critical weed-free period in hemp, and all crops have this sort of theoretical concept where, you know, if you can control the weeds during so many weeks initially as the crop gets established, then you can maintain reasonable yields by the end of the season. So there's this critical period when plants are more sensitive to competition, and you have to really take care of the weeds during that period of time. Well, we were looking at this, and there were students in my lab that were hand weeding our hemp plots at different intervals throughout the season. So some of the plots were not weeded at all. We planted the hemp and walked away, basically. And then there was a treatment that was only weeded for a week, and then 2 weeks and 3 weeks and so on. And there was one treatment that was weeded for the entire season. So we were all a little surprised when we did a preliminary analysis of the data, and we found that statistically, there was no difference whether or not we didn't weed the plants at all, or whether we weeded for 87 days, which was the entire season.
Wow.
So, exactly. That's that's what we thought as well. We could see a little bit of evidence for heavy grass competition. So we could see that the plots where there was a lot of grass competing around. Those were our 14-day weed treatments, but we could see a hit in the overall biomass with some of the competition. But it was just amazing that statistically there was no difference. So we're now in our second year of that study, and we'll be doing a more detailed data analysis, and we'll be looking at all the different yield components, because that was just a rough look at overall biomass of fiber and dual purpose crops. So yeah, it seems like it's one of those crops where if it gets a head start, it's fairly competitive.
Interesting. Yeah. So timing is everything.
Yeah, it is. It is.
No, but so just want to make sure I heard that correctly. So the amount that you weeded, whether you did none at all or you weeded throughout the whole thing, it didn't have an effect on the overall yield at the end?
It didn't on the overall biomass that was produced, not looking at quality of fiber or amount of seed yield. So just overall plant biomass. Now, there may be differences for each of those components, right? Because plants will, it's an investment strategy, right? So they may have been investing in growth and in structure and putting less into seed production, for example. So now that we have 2 years of data, I hope that we're able to sort of tease apart any of those differences. But and now we do have, of course, we have a pre-emergence herbicide that's labeled as well. So if farmers want to grow hemp now, there's more tools available to give the hemp a head start.
Okay, so that was going to be one of my questions. Are there approved herbicides for hemp?
This is recent, yeah. So there is now a pre-emergence herbicide that would do, hopefully, what we're talking about and give the hemp the head start that it needs for successful production. It's not. There are going to be some challenges for the weeds in our geography. Not all of the problem weeds are going to be well controlled by this herbicide, but it's more than we had before. So for farmers that are accustomed to growing corn and soybeans in herbicide managed systems, the goal would be to see this as another crop, potentially in rotation with those crops. One of the reasons that we have so much herbicide resistance, besides just the sheer amount of herbicides that we use, it's because we have very simplified rotations in our agricultural systems. So if we could put more crops in rotation with corn and soybeans, then our pest management challenges would change, and we wouldn't have such dominant weeds, theoretically.
Right. Okay. So a few things I want to make sure that I touch on with that question. So the first one, you said, it was specific to your geography. So are there regional considerations here for weed control in hemp?
Yes, there are. Some species are not uniformly distributed across the United States. There are certain geographies that have different problems. I think across most of the midwestern cropping region, the amaranthus species are a problem. If you're familiar with amaranthus seed, it's basically, they're plants in the same genus as that food crop that have become dominant agricultural weeds. And they've evolved resistances to multiple herbicides that have become a critical part of our crop production systems. So as they evolve very quickly, we're losing some of the herbicide tools that our farmers have relied upon. And there's something very special about those weeds. So those amaranthus weeds are dioecious, meaning that there are males and there are females, and they have to cross-pollinate to produce seeds. And those are the only species in our system that are what we call driver weeds that are evolving herbicide resistance so quickly. So the genetic exchange between those plants is, in a sense, driving evolution and genetic variation. And of course, the plant that we're introducing into the system, this is our first dioecious plant, as far as I've worked with, that is a crop species now.
And does that bring with it other challenges?
Well, potentially, right? Because hemp is it's the original weed, right?
Right. Hence the name, yeah.
So, we have in Illinois Victory hemp left over from World War II era that still grows in the ditch banks and roadsides around agricultural fields. So it still exists. It still is persistent. So that's another research question. In the fields where we're growing hemp for a crop, we're going to have to manage those volunteers as we rotate into other crops. So how easy is that going to continue to be? Are we going to be able to continue to manage hemp, which is very susceptible right now to the herbicides that we use? So right now, yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of brought up the ditchweed that that is still out there. Is that a weed for all intents and purposes for if you're growing hemp? Could that potentially be an issue?
Well, it depends, right? If you're growing floral CBD hemp, then yes, that is an issue for you and your product quality, and potentially for other crops as well. But I think more importantly, it's important to consider that as a reservoir for very important genetic traits that might be useful for future crop production. Those plants have existed for decades successfully in these areas. They are tolerant to the environmental conditions that they're being exposed to and to the ecological interactions. So that shouldn't be dismissed. I don't think they should be devalued. I think that in the future they could have a very real contribution to future breeding programs.
That's actually very interesting. I don't know if you're aware, but here at Medicinal Genomics, we do sequencing on cannabis varieties, hemp varieties, things like that to help breeders kind of identify these traits. I don't think we've ever had any ditchweed or any of that we've actually sequenced. I know we have some landrace strains that are kind of from other parts of the world, but I don't know if we have any that are native to the United States. That'd be really interesting. I'm gonna bring that up to the CSO right after this.
Yeah, that would be. In Southern Illinois, we have a very heavy soil type, and we find that it interacts with our heavy spring rainfalls. So there's a period during the initial part of the season where we do have ponding in our soils, and it's really difficult for the early planted hemp crop to survive because it's not very tolerant to waterlogging. So that's where maybe there's that trait that exists in one of those weedy populations that would allow it to tolerate heavy soils a little bit better. So yeah, those are the types of things where I do think there's a lot of value in looking at those feral populations that still exist.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So back to herbicides. We talked about that there are some approved or an approved herbicide that recently came online. So I know that hemp is a bioaccumulator. So are there considerations with that in using like an herbicide that it might, kind of accumulate in the crop?
Yeah, and I guess I'm probably not the best to talk about herbicide tolerance levels, so residues in crops. I do agree that hemp can be a bioaccumulator. I guess the type of production that we're looking at, I'm really more interested in seeing fiber production. So in that case, anything that's bioaccumulated could actually be a benefit. If you use it for remediation purposes, then you could lock away those chemical compounds that the plant takes up in hempcrete, into structures that are not going to be degraded and released in the future. So in that case, that could be a beneficial characteristic of that crop plant.
Interesting.
You need to be careful for other food-based commodity types, right? For seed and especially for floral production.
Yes, definitely. And I would think too that there must be concerns also if you're growing near other crops that some of the herbicides that are maybe used on those crops could drift into your fields.
Yeah, and we have seen that a bit. Herbicide drift has been a concern, especially in some geographies. We see that hemp is sensitive to some of those herbicides, and in some of the preliminary work that we've done, we haven't seen a huge yield impact when hemp is drifted upon by other herbicides. So again, that does go back to the need to establish herbicide tolerances and safety levels on hemp, depending on what it's going to be used for in the future.
And so given that, hemp was banned for so long until kind of the Farm Bill a few years ago kind of opened things up. And so how far behind are we in researching, weed prevention in hemp?
Well, really far behind.
Yeah.
There's not really a lot known as far as hemp's competitive ability. I'm working with a colleague here at SIU to just set up some species by species competition studies, just to look at some of our most problematic weeds, put them in different numbers, growing with different number of hemp plants in pots in the greenhouse, and just simply look at the impact of that competition at different densities on that target hemp plant. So it's just the things that, just a lot of things that we don't know. In my mind, you could take pretty much any publication that's been done in soybeans, looking at weed control, and probably redo that, and it would be completely novel in hemp. So there's nothing but questions right now, very few answers. And we do have two herbicides, actually. So the sonolin, ethylfluoralin is the pre-emergence compound. And then there's a post-emergence compound, which is quizalofop, or Assure2 is the trade name, but it's only a grass-specific compound. So you can spray it across the top of the hemp plants and at least kill the grasses that would be competing, but it's not going to impact the broadleaf plants that are growing and competing with the hemp. So it's something, right? It's a full herbicide program, a pre-emergence compound plus a post-emergence compound that growers are conceptually familiar with working with.
And now, are herbicides the best tool against weed control, or are there other options?
They're the most commonly used tool, as partly as a result of the sheer number of acres that our farmers manage. If you go into organic production, for example, you're relying either on tillage to control the weeds up until a certain point until you can't till anymore without hurting the crop, or you're heavily reliant upon cover crop species that would suppress the weeds. And there is a potential to see cover crops used in hemp production. I know there have been some pilot studies that have been conducted, and the cover crop literature is well established that you can suppress some of our most problematic weeds with a good cover crop that accumulates enough biomass. And that's really the key, is giving that cover crop the chance to accumulate the biomass it needs.
And the cover crop's not going to compete with the hemp?
Well, you would terminate it typically. The way that cover crops are grown ahead of corn or soybeans, corn is a little bit more sensitive, so you terminate the cover crop typically before you plant the corn. Soybeans are less sensitive, and some growers are going into this program where they plant green, meaning that they don't kill the cover crop. They just plant the soybeans directly into it and let the soybeans emerge, and then they come back and kill the cover crop. And again, it's just going towards accumulating the biomass. There has to be enough biomass for that cover crop to suppress the weeds. So they're just trying to give the cover crop a little bit of extra time after planting. So something similar would have to be done with hemp, where you would kill the cover crop, and we have a roller crimper planter where we can terminate the cover crop by basically mashing it down and creating a mat of residue, and we'll plant the crop into that and clear spaces for the crop seeds to emerge. But then between the crop rows, we rely on the cover crop to suppress the weeds.
Interesting. So what other tools are available to kind of help control weeds?
Yeah, so again, going back to using hemp in a rotational strategy,
that's what I meant to come back to. I'm glad you brought up rotation.
Excellent. Well, I think there's a lot of potential, because the work that we've done, that my lab has done, has shown that some of our driver weeds, the most problematic species, don't emerge well from hemp residue. So there is a system in management of other crops called chaff lining. And you can think about a combine moving across the field and harvesting soybeans, for example. So the combine is collecting the soybean seed, and then out the back of the combine, all the residue, the crop residue, the stems, all the other material is being deposited back on the field. Well, Australian farmers came up with this really neat system where they take the finest particles of that crop and they funnel it into a line in the back of the combine. And not only is it the finest particles of the crop, but it's also the weed seeds. So they deposit the weed seeds in this crop residue. It's this pile of biomass in a line. And if you have precision planting technology, then you make those lines after every crop in the same place every year. So you're always putting your weed seeds back in a line in the field. And then, the great thing is they're going to be there so that you can do other management practices on top of that line. You've concentrated them. It's not that you're preventing them from germinating so much, but hemp, on the other hand, if you were to use hemp in a chaff lining strategy and look at the biochemical properties of the hemp biomass, there might be the potential to suppress the germination of those weeds because of the biochemistry of that crop plant. So that's one thing that my lab has conceptually looked at, and a way that I think hemp could actually be a positive a driver in creating a more sustainable rotational system.
Interesting. So if I followed, so you're kind of having all the waste from the previous harvest in these lines, and that includes the weeds and the seeds and everything. And typically those weeds will germinate, but with hemp, they don't.
So what we found in chaff lining systems in general, we had hoped that the seeds would decay more quickly because you're putting them in biomass where microbes are going to be working harder, right? But we don't see them decaying. We actually see that biomass protects the seeds and they can remain viable for longer. So that's not what we had hoped, but at least we can show that we're concentrating the seeds in one location. If we concentrate them in hemp biomass, then yes, we do see a suppressive effect of the hemp mulch. I don't know how long it will last. It depends on, the amount of rainfall and microbial action. So rainfall and temperature would be major drivers of that. But yeah, there's the potential to get a little bit of added benefit from suppression of those biochemicals found in hemp. Potentially.
Interesting. So going back to crop rotation, would hemp be a good candidate crop to be rotating with your soybeans or your corn or things like that?
Oh, I think it's still unknown. So some of the corn herbicides may be a little bit hard on hemp if you rotate from corn to hemp. So that's something that we've seen observationally, but I haven't really quantified. So there can be some rotational issues potentially, but it goes back to, if you really got the hemp established, you could get a really good suppressive year where you didn't have a lot of weeds germinate. And that's a form of seed bank control, right? For these summer annual plants that are problems, that are weeds in our corn and soybean systems, their strategy is just to produce seeds, right? If a summer annual produces seeds, then it's basically one for that year. So we could possibly reduce seed production if we can get a suppressive stand of hemp, and then any seeds that are produced could be lined in a chaff lining system potentially. But there are a lot of questions as far as rotational strategies. I think it's unknown as far as the number of pathogens that the crops may share in rotation. And I'm not sure if we know which crop should follow which right now, what the best temporal rotation really is. So I know there are other people working on that. So hopefully one day we'll have an answer.
Excellent. What about mulching or plastic covering? Does that help as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the more common ways that I see floral hemp produced in our local geography is with plastic mulch. Of course, that in itself can have some environmental sustainability implications. But any sort of material that could be mulched with, so even an organic mulch material that could suppress the weeds, that would be very helpful as well.
Excellent. And in my research, I will confess I am not a cultivation expert, but what is integrated weed management?
So that is that's the focus of my lab, actually. Yes.
I'm glad I asked.
We do a lot of work with herbicide resistance, and I study herbicide efficacy and the way that we should use herbicides in our cropping systems to control weeds. But if you look at the evolution of herbicide resistance and the increasing cases, it's very clear that we're putting herbicides under a lot of pressure. So weeds are evolving herbicide resistance, really faster than we can create new herbicides at this point. So integrated weed management is the idea that you should develop a more diversified strategy for weed control, and you should put more pressures on the weeds besides just herbicides, right? It's the same thing with, microbial resistance to antibiotics. It's the same type of selection that's happening. So if we can put in cover crops and harvest weed seed control tactics like chaff lining, like I was mentioning, if we can build an ecologically robust system where we have seed predators, insects in the field that are eating seeds. And we can, capitalize more on some of these ecological interactions that are happening. Then that integrated system, you can still use herbicides, but you're putting less pressure on the herbicides, and you're probably at some point you're beginning to slow the evolution of herbicide resistance.
Right. Yeah, it seems like herbicides are really the short-term solution, but with really potentially severe long-term effects.
Well, and it partly goes back to the need to be, financially sustainable in the short term. Sure. And, learning to manage other tactics, like learning to manage cover crops in the system. It's like, in a way, learning to manage a whole new crop, right? So you're increasing the complexity of the system, whereas herbicides are a simplified strategy, but they come with a prescription, when to apply them, what to apply, and you're relatively guaranteed to some degree a success if you do things in the right way. And when you start adding all of these other tactics in, then some of the interactions become less predictable, and that means that the yields can be less predictable. And for a farmer who's maybe not as comfortable financially, it can be very difficult to take those risks. So there's a lot to the conversation as far as, the adoption of more ecologically based practices. It can be really risky for some people.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. And especially with hemp too. I think a lot of people got into hemp production, particularly for CBD, assuming that there was going to be this huge market for it. And then there was kind of overproduction and the prices really fell through the floor. So definitely a consideration.
Yeah, and for our growers here locally, there are a lot of folks that are interested in growing fiber and potentially seed crops. but the market is still not there to support them. So they can experiment on a small scale, but there's not going to be a lot of potential for that return on investment right now.
Yeah, no, that is definitely the case. And I mean, not to put you on the spot, and if you don't want to answer this, we can certainly cut it out. But why do you think that other types or other commodities associated with hemp really haven't taken off yet? It really has been focused primarily on the cannabinoids.
Yeah, great question. It seems like it's kind of a chicken and the egg type scenario, right? I mean, in order to have a market that's built around a commodity, you have to have the farmer that's going to produce it. Well, in order for the farmer to produce it, that person has to have a place to sell it after they produce it. So it's, I think, more of a question of establishing some of these basic market initiatives across a large scale, right? So if you're a processor, if you want to establish a processing facility, that means, 2 years ahead of your facility, you're already reaching out and contracting up to 1,000 acres of production with local growers. And then you're working with them so that they understand how to grow the crop, and you're providing some agronomic oversight while you're building your facility. And then everything comes online, and then you have your growers contracted, and you have your product coming in, and then you just continue to build capacity after that. So it's not just like building a facility and then it's good, right? You have to have a knowledgeable grower base to go along with that for that to be successful.
Got it. Well, that is a great answer. So, all right. So winding down here, and you've touched on it already, but I want to give you another chance to talk about. So what's next? What are you working on now, and what can we expect to see in the future?
Yeah, so we're continuing to be part of a large-scale cultivar trial where we're just planting different cultivars all across the U.S. in different geographies to see what the genetic by environmental impacts are for each cultivar. So ideally, I hope that we can identify some cultivars that do really well in Southern Illinois and kind of expand our grower options here. So that's one of the things that we'll continue to do. And then we're wrapping up our critical weed-free period and management study that's funded by the USDA. So within the next year, I hope to have all those data analyzed and published. So that's something to look for. And then you'd mentioned cover crops. I hope to establish a couple of pilot cover crop studies just to see what that looks like, because we've never really experimented with planting hemp into cover crops, at least not yet.
Excellent. That sounds great. Also, want to give you a chance to share any other resources that you think that the audience might be interested in if they're interested to learn more about weed control and hemp.
Sure. Well, the resources are still being developed, so I hope that those will be shared more in the future. But we do have a growing cannabis science center here at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. So there are some resources on the Cannabis Science Center webpage, and you can see what our diverse faculty group is doing and how we're coming together to study cannabis.
Excellent. All right, Karla. Well, this has been fun. It was a great conversation. Excited to see some more results of what you're working on, and hopefully see you up on the CannMed stage real soon.
That'd be great. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me today.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Karla Gage. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed. And thanks again to this episode's sponsor, Rare Earth Genomics. Our next episode drops December 12th. That's 2 weeks from today. In the meantime, please do go to CannMedEvents.com now and sign up for CannMed 24 at the early bird rate. That deadline for the early bird rate is December 1st. Also, I invite you to follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for CannMed Events. And lastly, please rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you use to watch or listen to the podcast. We really appreciate it. All right, that's it from us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and please do come back to the next CannMed Coffee Talk.